There's a photograph in a shoebox in my closet that I've moved 4 times across 3 different apartments, and until about 8 months ago, I was the only person alive who knew it existed. I should explain what it actually is because it's not what you're probably picturing. It's not an ex, it's not anything scandalous. It's a photo of a stranger, taken at a wedding I worked at 5 years ago, a guy I never spoke to, never learned the name of, and never expected to see again in my life. I'm a photographer, not a famous one, nothing glamorous, mostly weddings and the occasional corporate headshot when rent gets tight. 5 years ago I was still an assistant, second shooter for a woman named Delors who did most of the weddings in our part of the city. And one Saturday in October, we were covering a wedding at this old restored barn venue, out past the highway, golden hour light coming through the big sliding doors in that way that makes literally everyone look like they're in a movie. I was on reception duty, which mostly means wandering the edges of the room catching candids nobody poses for, the real moments instead of the staged ones. And at some point near the dessert table, I caught this one guy, a wedding guest not part of the bridal party, laughing at something someone off camera had said, head tipped back slightly, this completely unguarded, full-body kind of laugh that you almost never get to actually capture, because people tense up the second they notice a camera. He hadn't noticed, it was just there, real, gone in about a second and a half. I took the shot on instinct, the way you do when something in your gut says that's the one before your brain has even caught up to why. I didn't think about it again that night. It wasn't even a photo the couple needed, it was just background footage of a stranger at their wedding, the kind of image that normally gets deleted in the editing process because it's not relevant to the final album. Except I never deleted it. I printed it actually a few weeks later, mostly because I was building a personal portfolio of candid work, and it was technically one of the best unposed shots I'd ever gotten. That's the story I told myself for years, that it was about the craft, the light, the composition. I didn't examine too closely why I kept that one print specifically in a shoebox instead of a portfolio folder, why I looked at it more than the reason I gave myself accounted for, why some small, unspoken part of me used to wonder, every so often, whatever happened to that guy, what his laugh sounded like out loud instead of just frozen on paper. I moved twice in the years after that, and the shoebox came with me both times, tucked into the back of whatever closet I had. I told exactly nobody about it. It wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense, nobody was hiding anything from anybody. It was just a private, slightly embarrassing thing I didn't examine and definitely didn't bring up in conversation. The way you don't mention every strange, sentimental object you've held onto for reasons you can't fully name. Then, about a year ago, my roommate at the time moved out to live with his boyfriend, and I needed someone new to split rent with, and I put up a post on one of those roommate finder apps, the kind where you write a paragraph about yourself and hope you don't end up living with a stranger who turns out to be a nightmare. That's how Rowan found me. His message was short, funny, self-deprecating about his own cooking skills in a way that made me laugh out loud reading it alone in my kitchen. Something about how his last apartment's smoke detector considered itself a permanent roommate because of how often he set it off. We met for coffee before he ever saw the apartment, just to make sure neither of us was insufferable in person, which is apparently a smarter first step than most people take with roommate arrangements. He showed up 12 minutes late, apologizing before he'd even sat down, explaining he'd gotten turned around because he still wasn't used to this part of the city, and there was something disarming about how genuinely embarrassed he seemed over 12 minutes, like he actually cared about the impression rather than just performing politeness. We talked for almost 2 hours, way longer than a roommate interview needed to go, about his job doing data work for a non-profit, about my photography, about a disastrous camping trip he'd taken with college friends that he told with this dry, self-deprecating rhythm that had me laughing loud enough that the barista looked over twice. He wasn't insufferable. He was, if anything, easy in a way I wasn't prepared for, this quick, dry sense of humor, genuinely curious questions about my work, an easy laugh that I noticed, distantly, felt familiar in some way I couldn't place and didn't try very hard to place. We agreed on the apartment before we'd even finished our coffee. The first few months of living together were exactly what you'd hope for from a roommate situation, and nothing more dramatic than that. We fell into an easy rhythm, splitting chores without much friction, watching bad reality TV some nights, occasionally cooking together when neither of us wanted to eat alone. There was one night, maybe 2 months in, where we stayed up until almost 2 a.m, putting together a bookshelf from a box that came with what I'm fairly convinced were the wrong instructions, both of us laughing too hard to actually finish the job properly, and I remember going to bed that night thinking, distinctly, that I hadn't laughed that easily with anyone in longer than I wanted to admit. I started noticing things about him the way you do when you live with someone, small habits, the way he hummed slightly off-key while doing dishes, the specific face he made when a show's plot twist genuinely surprised him, How he always left one dish undried on the rack out of what I eventually learned was pure superstition from childhood. Something about his grandmother telling him leaving one dish for morning kept the house's luck balanced, which he swore he didn't actually believe and did anyway every single night. I noticed, too, somewhere around month 3, that I was noticing these things more than a person notices a roommate's habits, and I filed that under things I wasn't going to examine too closely either, the same way I'd filed the shoebox for years. There was one Sunday morning, around month 5, when Rowan asked, out of nowhere over coffee, if he could tag along on one of my photo walks, the aimless kind I did most weekends just to keep my eye sharp between paying gigs. I said sure, expecting him to get bored within 20 minutes, but he didn't. He walked beside me for almost 3 hours, asking genuine questions about why I chose one angle over another, patient in a way most people aren't when watching someone else work. At one point, I caught him watching a street musician instead of the shot I was setting up, this unguarded, quietly delighted look on his face, and I almost lifted the camera on instinct before catching myself, some old habit flaring up before I remembered whose face it was this time. I didn't take that photo. I told myself it was because it felt different somehow, more personal, though I didn't examine why until much later. I want to be honest that I didn't do anything about it. I didn't flirt, not really, not on purpose. I told myself the timing was bad, that ruining a good living situation over feelings I wasn't even sure were real yet wasn't worth the risk, and I got fairly good at just quietly enjoying his company without namming what it was becoming. There was one evening, maybe 6 months in, that I think about differently now, knowing what I know. Rowan came home from a family phone call looking drained in a way I hadn't seen from him before, and when I asked what was wrong, he said his aunt had called about a family gathering coming up, and had asked casually if he was still doing that thing, meaning being gay, like it was a phase up for renewal or cancellation, and he'd laughed it off on the phone the way he apparently always did, and then hung up and sat on our couch looking hollowed out in a way that didn't match the laugh at all. I didn't know then that this was connected to anything from 5 years earlier. I just sat with him that night, ordered food neither of us really wanted, and didn't push him to talk more than he was ready to. He thanked me for that quietly before bed, and I didn't think much more about it at the time, beyond noticing how much I hated that anyone made him feel like he needed to shrink himself for their comfort. Then, about 8 months into living together, I was reorganizing my home office, which had turned into the kind of chaotic storage closet every photographer's second bedroom eventually becomes, boxes of old prints, backup hard drives, gear I hadn't touched in years. Rowan offered to help mostly, I think, because he was bored on a rainy Saturday and wanted an excuse to talk while I worked. He was going through a box of old prints, just idly flipping through them, asking about a few, this one from a wedding, that one from a photo walk I'd done downtown one winter, and then he went quiet in this particular way that made me look up from what I was doing. He was holding the photo from the shoebox. I hadn't even realized that box had ended up mixed in with the ones he was sorting. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and his face was doing something complicated that I couldn't immediately read, and he said, "This is me." I said what even though I'd already understood, my whole stomach dropping in this slow, vertiginous way. He turned the photo around to show me, like I hadn't taken it myself, and said, "This is me, I remember this. This was my cousin Danny's wedding, out at that barn place 5 years ago. I remember laughing at something my aunt said about the best man's toast going long." He looked back up at me. "Why do you have a photo of me from 5 years ago in a shoebox in your closet?" I didn't have a smooth answer ready. I stumbled through the actual explanation, the assistant photographer job, the candid shot, the fact that I genuinely hadn't known his name or seen him again until he messaged me about the apartment listing, and I watched his face cycle through several reactions while I talked, confusion first, then something more guarded, and I understood, watching that guard go up, exactly what it must have sounded like from the outside. A photographer who'd apparently kept a stranger's photo for 5 years, and then, by some enormous coincidence, ended up living with that exact stranger. He said, careful, not unkind but definitely wary, "That's a strange coincidence. I want to believe that's all it is, but I'd be lying if I said it doesn't feel a little unsettling hearing it out loud." I told him I understood completely why it sounded that way, and that if I were hearing this story from the outside I'd probably feel the same wariness, but that I genuinely hadn't recognized him when he first messaged me, hadn't put it together until this exact moment standing in my office, and that whatever this coincidence meant, it wasn't some elaborate scheme. It was just an accident that had been sitting in a shoebox, not doing anything to anybody for 5 years before today. He was quiet for a while, turning the photo over in his hands, and then he said something that shifted the whole conversation somewhere I hadn't expected. He said, "Do you know what was actually happening that day, in this photo?" I said no, I'd never known anything about him beyond the half second I'd captured. He said that was the day I came out to my extended family. Not on purpose, exactly. My aunt cornered me about why I didn't bring a girlfriend to the wedding, and I just told her right there, because I was tired of dodging it, and it went about as badly as you'd expect at a family wedding with 3 generations of relatives within earshot. I spent most of that reception feeling like I was performing being fine, smiling through this specific kind of humiliation, and I genuinely don't remember laughing like that, not really, not until you just showed me this. He looked at the photo again, longer this time. I've spent 5 years remembering that day as one of the worst of my life, and there's apparently a version of me in a stranger's shoebox laughing like it didn't happen at all, like there was still a real, whole person in there somewhere underneath all of it. I didn't know what to say to that. I told him, honestly, that from where I'd been standing, that laugh hadn't looked like performance at all, that it was the specific, unrepeatable kind of unguarded that photographers spend entire careers chasing and rarely catch, and that whatever was happening in the rest of that day, that particular second had been completely real. I remember my aunt's phone call 6 months ago, he said suddenly, connecting something in his own head. The one where she asked if I was still doing that thing. Same aunt, same family. It's been going on for years, this specific way they have of treating who I am like a phase they're waiting out. I've spent 5 years telling myself that day at the wedding was just one bad instance of it, not the whole pattern, but sitting here right now, I'm realizing it's never really stopped, has it? And there's a version of me in a photograph who didn't know any of that was still coming. I didn't try to fix that for him. I just said, I'm sorry that's still happening, and I'm glad, selfishly, that at least one afternoon it got interrupted by something real, even if it was an accident. He looked up at me and something in his face had changed, softer now, less guarded, and he said, quiet. I think I need to sit with this for a minute. Not because I think you're some kind of stalker. I don't think that, not really, not after hearing the actual story. I just need to figure out what to do with finding out a stranger caught the one true moment of a day I've spent 5 years remembering as fake. He took the photo into his room, and I didn't see him again until dinner. Both of us were a little careful with each other, in a way we hadn't been in months, the easy rhythm briefly disrupted by something neither of us fully understood yet. Over the next couple weeks, something shifted between us, slow at first, then less slow. He started asking me more about the actual day of the wedding, what else I remembered from it, what the light had looked like, small details he wanted filled in about a day he'd mostly buried under a specific kind of pain. I found myself telling him things I hadn't thought about in years, the exact angle of the doorway, the particular gold color the light turned everything, and somewhere in the telling and retelling, it stopped being just about the photo and started being about us, sitting across from each other at our kitchen table most nights, talking later than either of us needed to. There was a night, about 3 weeks after he found the photo, when he brought it up again, out of nowhere, over dishes, and said, "Can I ask you something and you answer honestly, even if it's awkward?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Did you think about me, after that wedding, before the apartment thing, or is that me projecting something onto a photo that was just a good shot?" I told him the truth, because there didn't seem to be a version of dodging that question that wouldn't feel like a smaller kind of lie. I said, "Yeah, actually. Not constantly, not in some obsessive way, but I used to wonder sometimes, genuinely, whatever happened to the guy in that photo, what he was like beyond that half second, whether the rest of him matched the way that particular moment had looked." I told him I felt a little ridiculous saying that out loud, that it sounded borderline unhinged, phrased plainly like that, holding onto a feeling about a stranger for 5 years. He didn't laugh at me, which I appreciated. He just looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's not unhinged, that's just honest. And for what it's worth, I think I've spent the last 8 months slowly falling for the actual whole version of whatever that photo only got half a second of. I just didn't know how to say that without it sounding like I was making something out of a coincidence." I said, "I don't think it's just a coincidence anymore, not entirely." He said, "No, I don't think it is either." And that was the moment, standing at the sink with soap still on his hands, when he leaned over and kissed me, careful at first, like he was checking whether the moment was real before letting himself fully believe it, and then not careful at all. We told our friends a couple weeks later, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, and I watched the table's reaction go from mild surprise that the 2 roommates were suddenly holding hands to genuine delight, once someone made the connection between the framed photo I'd brought over as a joke and the story behind it. Our friend Marcus laughed so hard he nearly knocked over his drink, saying it was the most photographed thing he'd ever heard, falling for someone twice, 5 years apart, without realizing it was the same person both times. Rowan just squeezed my hand under the table and said, dry as ever, in my defense, I didn't recognize him either. We're both apparently terrible at faces. I want to tell you it was simple after that, but it wasn't entirely, because Rowan needed time to work through what it meant that someone had documented him at his most painful, most performative day, and found in it the one truthful thing he couldn't even remember about himself. There were nights in the weeks after where he'd get quiet thinking about that wedding, about the family members who still, even now, treated his coming out like an inconvenient interruption to be worked around rather than an actual fact of who he was. And I learned to just sit with him through those nights instead of trying to fix them, because some things don't need fixing, they just need someone willing to stay in the room while you feel them. We've been together 7 months now, on top of the year we've lived together as roommates before that, which makes the actual math of our relationship a strange, layered thing neither of us fully knows how to explain at parties. The photo lives in a frame now, on our shared bookshelf, not hidden anymore, and Rowan likes to tell people, when they ask about it, that his boyfriend photographed him 5 years before they ever officially met, which usually gets a reaction somewhere between charmed and slightly weirded out, exactly the reaction I got the day he first found it in that box. His aunt called again a few weeks ago, ahead of another family gathering, and this time Rowan didn't laugh it off. He told me about the call afterward, said he told her plainly that he wasn't doing a thing, he was living his actual life, and that if she couldn't manage to treat it as permanent, she was welcome to sit that gathering out. He said his hands were shaking the whole call, but that something about knowing there was a version of himself, captured on film years before he had the nerve to say something like that, gave him a strange kind of borrowed courage in the moment, like he was finally catching up to the person that photograph had already believed he could be. I think about that half second sometimes, how close that photo came to never mattering to anyone but me, how easily I could have deleted it in the editing process, the way I deleted 100 other background shots from that same wedding, how the whole rest of this could have simply never happened if I'd been slightly less sentimental about one candid frame 5 years ago. I don't think it was fate, not in some grand sense I actually believe in. I think it was just a small, stubborn instinct to keep something beautiful a little longer than I had a reason to, and it turned out, years later, that the reason had just been running late. If there's something in your life you've held onto without fully knowing why, some photo, some memory, some feeling you never examined too closely because it didn't seem to need an explanation at the time, I'd tell you not to throw it out too quickly. You never know which quiet, unexplained thing you're holding onto is actually waiting for the rest of its story to catch up.